Good afternoon, folks. Excuse me. Well, we got a good one for you. We all know the Big Ten East favors the two rivalries, the arch rivalries between Ohio State and that team up north. We all know. I mean, the two powerhouses literally have played lights out all season. I mean, if you want to look at their record, it's pretty much set in stone right now. Now, the Big Ten West, on the other hand, in the winner of the Big Ten East, if it's either Michigan or Ohio State, winner will automatically win a bid to the Big Ten Championship East. Runner-up, who knows if he'll even make it to the tournament game. Now, as of this game, the Big Ten West is just an absolute screwed up mess right now. You got Illinois, who has 4 losses. You got Purdue, who has 4 Big Ten losses. You got... The list goes on. You got Minnesota with 4 losses. Now Minnesota, and then Iowa with 4 losses. I mean, the winner here, if Ohio State beats that team up north, it could be a rematch between Iowa and Ohio State. I mean, Iowa has to lose for Purdue to get in. Then, for Illinois to get in, Illinois has to win. And Purdue and Iowa both have to lose. I mean, that's literally what this is. Now, if you want the stats here, it's just an all messed up thing right now. But right now, it looks as if Iowa's going to win because they've pretty much got it all made in. But now, let's look at how that team up north did last year on total offense and defense. The right side, the second number I give you will be the amount of yards they put up. And that'll also be this year. Then we'll do Ohio State. Now, Western Michigan versus it was a 47-14 win for that team up north last year. 310 yards to 551 allowed to 551 yards. Pretty big significance there. Now, Washington, a 31-10 win over Washington. 343 yards allowed to 387 yards. Pretty good game there. Now, Northern Illinois, 208 yards allowed to 606 yards. Good game. Now, Rutgers, pretty good. Actually, Northern Illinois was a 63-10. Excuse me, I didn't put down the score. Now, Rutgers from last year, 20-13. 352 yards allowed to 275 yards. That's a big, significant numbers. Rutgers had all the chances in the game to win that game. But they failed to capitalize on a lot of mistakes that Michigan made. Now, as of Wisconsin, 210 yards allowed, 365 yards. Now, Nebraska. Nebraska had every opportunity to win that game. So many opportunities. But failed to capitalize on all of them. 431 yards allowed to 459 yards. Then you got Northwestern. 233 yards allowed to 457 yards. Now the game that really turns your head if you're that team up north fan. Michigan State 37. That team up north 33. 395 yards allowed to 552. Just one more yard than you had against Western Michigan. And you begin to ask yourself, how did that happen? When the most yards you had was your third game of the year at 606 yards. Good question. But yet somehow you still managed to lose the game. And then Indiana, 195, it was 29-7. 195 yards allowed to 411. Then you have Penn State, 21-17 win over Penn State. 332 yards allowed. Excuse me. Sorry about that. 332 yards allowed to 361 yards. And then Maryland this year. That was 2021. You have 59-18 stomping of Maryland. Very good team. 359 yards to 503 yards. And then Ohio State. Ohio State's defense was dismantled. Abysmal. Ohio State's defense was nothing but garbage. 458 yards allowed to 487 yards after a 42-27 win. I cannot believe Ohio State was just that bad. Now, as you know, I'm a diehard Buckeye fan. As you've seen in some things, as you've seen in some of my videos where I've been sitting at different angles and everything. You've seen the horseshoe above my bed and everything. Then that team up north went into Big Ten Championship and pretty much manhandled Iowa. 279 yards allowed to 461 yards. Then their biggest letdown of all year is when they went into one of the final, is when they were in the playoffs, when they played Georgia and got manhandled. 34-11. 521 yards allowed to 328 yards. Sad. Now, we jump to 2022 season. Colorado State. That team up north wins 51-7. 219 yards allowed to 440 yards. Then they played Hawaii. 56-10. 253 yards allowed to 558 yards. Then you got Connecticut. 59-0. That's a stomping now. 110 yards allowed to 465 yards. Then Maryland. A much more improved Maryland team, I gotta say. They're not like they once were, like they were last year. They're not weak like they were. After a 34-27 win, they literally just get by only by a touchdown. 397 yards allowed to 463 yards. And then Iowa, 27-14. That team up north gets past Iowa. 281 yards allowed to 327 yards. Then you beat Indiana, 31-10. 222 yards allowed to 469 yards. Then Penn State, 41-17, dismantling of Penn State. 268 yards allowed to 563 yards. Then Michigan State, 29-7, 252 yards allowed to 443 yards. Then you have Rutgers, 52-17, stomping of Rutgers. 180 yards allowed to 433 yards. Then you got Nebraska, 34-3, stomping of Nebraska. 146 yards allowed to 412 yards. And then the tough one, Illinois, 326 yards allowed to 376 yards. I mean, these games right here pretty much will sum up that team up north pretty well. I mean, if you really want to talk about, say that one team's better than the other, you're sadly mistaken. Now, let's look at Ohio State stats. Ohio State, right now, if we look at last year's stats versus this year's stats, Minnesota, final score, 45-31. 408 yards allowed to 495 yards. Then when they lost to Oregon, another dismantled game, 505 yards allowed to 612 yards. Then they come away with another ugly win over Tulsa, 41-20, 501 yards allowed to 511. Then they played against Akron, 600 with 229 yards allowed to 622. Now, then they played Rutgers. 52-13 win over Rutgers with 346 yards allowed to 541 yards. Then they played Maryland. 66-17 win over Maryland. 335 yards allowed to 598. Then they stomped Indiana. 54-7, 128 yards allowed to 539. Then Penn State, 33-24, 394 yards allowed to 467 yards. Then they just get past Nebraska, 26-17. 361 yards allowed to 495 yards. Then they nailed Purdue, 59-31, 481 yards allowed to 624 yards. Then Michigan State, they stomped 56-7, 224 yards allowed to 665 yards. The most all season. One of the most all season. Then that team up north, they fall to them 42-27. 487 yards allowed to 458. Another disappointing numbers there. But then they go to the Rose Bowl and beat out Utah 48-45, allowing 463 yards allowed to 683. I mean, that's a pretty significant number there. Now we jump to this year with Notre Dame. A 21-10 win, 253 yards allowed to 395 yards. Then Akron State, 45-12 win, 276 yards allowed to 538 yards. And then Toledo, a 77-21 stomping, 307 yards allowed to 763 yards. So far the most I've seen all year. And then Wisconsin, a 52-21 win, 296 yards allowed to 539 yards. And then Rutgers, a 49-10 win, 187 yards allowed to 413 yards. Michigan State, 49-20, 202 yards allowed to 614 yards. Then you got Iowa, 159 yards allowed to 360 yards. Then Penn State, 44-31, 482 yards allowed to 452. Kind of disappointing on those numbers, but it is what it is. And then Northwestern, 21-7, another dismantled performance. 285 yards allowed to 283 yards. Then Indiana, 56-14, 269 yards allowed to 662 yards. And then Maryland, 43-30, 402 yards allowed to 401 yards, only by one, just like Northwestern, but only 2 yards difference. Now, if you look at these numbers from the year before to these numbers when it comes to defense, that's a significant big difference. Now, don't get me wrong, Penn State and Maryland were pretty much, very sad numbers, but, and Toledo, but that's a little different ballgame. They had a pretty good quarterback that pretty much kept them in the game. They pretty much stopped them, but Maryland is a significantly better team than what they were a year ago, so you gotta say hats off to them. Now, what do these two teams, Michigan and Ohio State, that team up north and Ohio State, what do they have differently? Let's break it down here. If you look at the numbers here between the two, if you look at the first game of this year versus the game last year, 408 yards allowed to 253 yards, that's a big number. Minnesota is not a weak team by all means. They are not a weak team. Now, Oregon, I'm not really sure about them either. You can't really take them for granted at any time, considering they're pretty highly ranked right now, even though they just lost. But then again, they just won again. They won 505 to the second year against Arkansas State, 276. And Tulsa, I'm not really sure. Toledo, they're pretty much doing very well in the MAC, so you can't really look past Toledo if you're anything. Now, Wisconsin, on the other hand, they're not doing too bad. They're 6-5 in the league. Lost 5 games in the league. One to Ohio State and one to, I think they played Michigan. I'm not really sure. No, they didn't. Excuse me. Scratch that thought. Now, if you want to look at teams that are pretty bad right now, Northwestern. But Northwestern, anytime Ohio State plays anybody, everyone always gives Ohio State fits. It never fails. Anytime somebody plays Ohio State, they always give Ohio State fits. So everyone always gives Ohio State the run for their money. But I see a pattern in this game. This team is almost like the 2002 team. Except the difference is the games aren't as close as those games are. I'll get my book out sometime tomorrow. Later on tonight, I'll get my book out and compare those scores to these scores for Ohio State. We've yet to play Michigan, and I might get my book out and compare that game after the Michigan game, and we'll compare those scores. With that being said, I got some more research to do, and with that being said, I'm out of here. Peace. Oh, wait a minute, I forgot. Hit the like button, hit the bell for notifications, and with that being said, I'm out of here. Peace.